And I'm going to start recording. Okay. Hello, and welcome everybody. We're about to start our second session on the subject of planning for every learner. And I'm here with Gabriel Díaz Maggioli, who is going to be focusing on planning for learning, not teaching. So we're really excited to hear what you've got to say about that. I'm just going to give people a moment to join. So please come in. Welcome everybody. Say hello in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. So we like to see where you are. It's always interesting. I can see hello from Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Poland, Malta, Egypt, Turkey, Oman. It's starting to go so fast. Siberia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. This is fantastic. So welcome everybody. And yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So Gabriel, hello and welcome.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to see so many people from around the world joining us. Thank you for doing so.
Fantastic. We're really happy to have you. Where are you joining us from today,
I'm joining
Gabriel?
you today from Uruguay, South America.
Right. And what's the weather like?
Kind of muggy, gray skies, and we might get some rain this evening.
Oh, really? Oh
Yeah,
dear. Muggy, that's a
I-
good word. Yeah.
yeah, high summer here. So
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we're also, it's also a rainy day here in Barcelona, so I'm quite happy to be warm inside and cozy and listening to your interesting session. So, before I hand over to you, let me just tell our audience a little bit about you.
okay.
So, Gabriel Díaz Maggioli is a teacher who applies the lessons learned in his classroom to his roles as teacher educator, researcher, and author. So, a wealth of experience there. He's currently academic coordinator of the postgraduate diploma in English language teaching at University ORT in
ORT.
Uruguay.
No, actually, it's
Oh,
not spelled. It's ORT Universidad
okay,
ORT.
ORT. ORT. I looked it up
Universidad ORT.
earlier because I couldn't. I was like, what does that stand for? Ah, okay, but it's written in capitals.
It's written in capitals, yeah.
Okay, okay, thank you. Thanks for the correction. And Gabrielle was president of IATEFL from 2019 to 2024. So we're really excited to hear what you have to say about planning for learning and not teaching. You can share your slides now. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm here if you need me. See you
All
later.
righty. Thank you. Well, hello. I'm going to start by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Hopefully, not good night. I won't put you to sleep. Hopefully. Let's see how this works. It's so good to see so many colleagues from around the world joining. Um, my plan for today is pretty simple. I'm going to be telling you something about me. I already know about you because I've been following Emily Bryson's presentation. So I've seen your comments, I've seen your questions, and now thanks to this wonderful chat uh, app, I know that we have people from all over the world. So that is quite an honor for me, and I thank you profusely for joining us. I always say that I have a foot in the world of ELT, but also a foot in the world of education. So I'm going to try and bring the two worlds a little bit together in this talk. By doing what? By talking about how we learn and how we learn languages. Then by providing what I consider are some principles for teaching English in the 21st century, in 2025. Pardon me. And then sharing with you some strategies that you teachers can use to plan for students' learning, that is to say, to satisfy the students' learning needs. I work in the Global South, as many of you do, and we know that we have had reform after reform trying to bring English to the forefront of education, yet we find ourselves kind of lost with sometimes enormous groups, very low resources, and also with students who don't want to learn English, who are quite reticent. Whereas at the same time, despite all our efforts, we don't see the results of our teaching in the way that we envision them. So one of my suggestions is maybe we should change the focus, right? And give the students what they need, not what they want, what they need. And I'm going to try and give you a way of doing so. So these are the five parts of my presentation. Knowing me, knowing you. Let me tell you where I come from. As you know, as I have already said, I come from Uruguay. I work at Universidad ORT Uruguay, where I am the coordinator of postgraduate diploma in English language teaching. I also teach in the master's in education and the doctorate in education, supervising students and thesis. And also, I have another job. I live in and work in the global south, and I'm a teacher. So I have more than one job. And I work for the National Teacher Education College, which so far is the only institution in the country that can grant teaching degrees at the primary, secondary, and technical vocational level. I work in the languages department there. I'm a tenured professor, and there I train undergraduate students who are becoming teachers. And what I'm going to share with you are things that I've done with these students that have worked and things that they have done and inspired me to share. Everything I'm going to share today is um, um, what you say, has been authorized by the author to share. And then, at least in my neck of the woods and in most of Latin America, I see a strong tension between what do we teach? Do we teach language for communication or do we teach grammar and vocabulary? And then how do we put this together? How do students put this together so that they are fluent? This is one common complaint that I hear teachers in my country and in the area, in parts of Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil, in Paraguay, in Bolivia, and Peru, complain about. That the textbooks we use are very grammar oriented, yet we need to prepare students for real communication. And there's this chasm, if you wish, between what students expect when they think of I'm going to learn English, what they think is I'm going to learn how to speak English. But then they come to our classes and there's this whole thing about vocabulary and grammar and this and that, and the other. So sometimes the textbooks do not cater for the students' needs. Having said this is like a big advanced organizer. I would like you to share, if you could, an expectation in one or two words that you have for this webinar. And then let's open the chat to see what kind of expectations we have. You can write that in the chat to get new ideas, to change directions. Good. Uh, how to get the students as the source of learning, learn how to learn, continuous professional development, learning strategies, receive new ideas, learn something new. Good. New ideas, guiding learners, developing communication, learning how to plan for students' learning, well, ways of teaching, teaching skills. So most of you, from what I see, want the practical what to do on Monday morning. I'm going to give you that. But first, let me give you a little bit of a background on where we come from. Now, we kind of forget that almost every country in the world where English is not an official or used language has gone through some sort of reform by which English has become part of the regular curriculum of the primary school, the secondary school, the technical or vocational school. In this world, we have been bombarded by frameworks, methods, and approaches to teaching English, but sometimes we forget that if you are teaching in educational settings, right, even at the university setting, where English is just one more subject, one more requirement that students need to comply with in order to get whatever they get, their certificate, their diploma, whatever, that we are part of a teaching collective that sometimes strays away from what we do in our classrooms. And one of the things that we have seen systematically, at least in Latin America, and I'm talking from a research informed perspective, right? We still have a lot of teachers teaching classes in the mother tongue and giving students grammar paradigms to repeat. And so we have moved quite further into what really is the communicative approach about. And we need to start by considering whether some of the things that we hear so much about are about ELT only or general education. So here's the activity I'm going to propose. Can you spot those acronyms, because education is full of acronyms? From those acronyms, can you spot those that come exclusively from the world of English language teaching? Just enter them in the chat. PPP, yes. Project-based learning, TBL, ESA. Okay, TBL, PBL, ZPD. Well, this is just to show that all these terms that we relate to in our day-to-day lives in language teaching have become what we call literalized. So people have used them and abused them, and they have lost their initial meaning. Things like PPP, this is definitely ELT. ARC is a way of looking at the language we use in the classroom developed by Jim Scrivener. It's authentic language, restricted language, or language for communication. The ZPD is an educational concept that comes specially from the work of Vygotsky, and referring to special education is the zone of proximal development. ADHD, right? It's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and that is from the world of general education. Project-based learning, a lot of us say this is inherently ELT. It is not. Project-based learning has recently become a catchphrase in education. But the truth is that the project-based learning basis starts at the beginning of the 20th century and evolves mostly during the 1950s. TBL, yes, task-based learning, is inherently English language teaching, but lo and behold, some of it is now spilling into the general education world because of the effectiveness of the approach. ABE has to do with adult basic education, and that is, again, general education, although when we use the acronym ABE, particularly in the States, we refer to teaching English to immigrants and refugees who are adults. And then ESA, that is the brainchild of Jeremy Harmer, is engage, study, activate, right? Way of looking at what we do in the classroom. So there are things that move from English language teaching to general education and from general education to English language teaching. But if we look at the reforms around the world, and I've been lucky enough to be able to collaborate with colleagues around the world in all continents on some of these reforms, one thing that permeates every reform is constructivism. The look at how we learn that strays away from simple memorization that was characteristic of behaviorism. And in constructivism, there are different emphases, right? But basically, the theoreticians behind them are Piaget and Vygotsky. In language learning, constructivism means that students interpret and internalize new linguistic input through the lens of what they already know. So they're not blank slates to whom we have to teach, first of all, the verb to be. But these are people, children, teenagers, and adults who, in this interconnected world, they may have some background knowledge about the language we're trying to teach them, and we need to use that. What happens when students connect what they already know to the new inputs is what generates what Osubel calls meaningful learning. And we know that without meaningful learning, nothing can happen. To that, background knowledge becomes quite a decisive factor in what students are able to achieve. And background knowledge is a hugely massive term, right? But that has been researched at the wazoo. But in the last decade, right, these last 10 years, one certainty has emerged that when we activate learners' background knowledge or prior knowledge, their schemata, before we give them something new to learn, students understand better and they engage more in meaningful classroom interactions. It is when they can relate this new content to information they already have, things they are familiar with. And this is not just the language, it's the language, it's the context, it's the function, it's the meaning, it's the topic, right? They are able to process information more effectively, right? And they perform better because of that. Research over the past few years has also confirmed these things. When learners use what they already know to contribute to discussions, they grow in confidence and indirectly in motivation and are more likely to engage in meaningful conversations. We can look at motivation as a kind of equation by which students, and particularly if they are children or teenagers, but adults as well, they're going to say, okay, my teacher gave me this thing to do. The teacher has proposed this activity. They immediately calculate how much effort will I need to invest in completing this activity. And also, they're going to factor in how many chances of success do I have? So if the effort is too much and the chances of success are too low, they're not going to get motivated. If, by the same token, the effort that is required is very little and the result is certain that they're going to get it right, there's no motivation. There always has to be a tension between the effort and the chances of success. And how does this come to bear? By making students aware of who they are as learners, how they go about learning, and by telling them explicitly why we want them to learn something. The research also has shown that if we want to do true communicative language teaching, and particularly task-based language learning, which, if you think about it, tasks are classroom activities where students use any language at their disposal to try and communicate, to send a meaningful message. If you look at all methodologies, project-based learning, if you look at CLIL, content and language integrated learning, or content-based instruction in the United States, if you look at dogma, any kind of framework or approach to language teaching that is communicative, at the root, students are performing tasks, right? They are doing something with the language, not just talking about the language. And then I like to follow the school of task-based learning because they do a lot of research with real classrooms around the world. And in terms of when I face some teachers that said, no, 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 I cannot do task-based learning because my students need to learn the grammar. They want to know the grammar. They always ask me, sir or ma'am, how do I say it? I always refer them to this 2015 study by Van Patten and Williams that found that students who could relate new grammatical structures to concepts already familiar to them from their first language showed faster uptake, and better long-term retention. So background knowledge is not something that we only get through English. Background knowledge is a combination of our funds of knowledge. The funds of knowledge are those things that we learn in the hearth of our family in the first 3 years of our lives or so, that determines our values, our beliefs, the things we do and the things we don't do. It has to do with our identity as a family member. We bring that to education, and sometimes there are mistakes. And then through education, we get experiences. So background knowledge includes all this. Think of it as what lies behind, not getting into the same discussion you guys had with Emily about the future in front of us or behind us, but everything that a student brings to the act of teaching and learning. So we need background knowledge, but how it is that we learn, and in particular, how do we learn languages? I prepared a few sentences that I would like you to do something with. These are beliefs, opinions, ideas that I've collected from different colleagues around the world. You know they are numbered. We are going to do 2 rounds with these questions, with these sentences. What I would like you to do now is just take 1 minute and write down for each of these numbers whether you think that the statement is true or false. Okay? I'm going to switch off my camera so you see just the slide. Take a few minutes on a piece of paper, write down. While you do so, and I think you've already done it from all the little hearts that I'm seeing, um, let me tell you the perspective I come from. I mean, you may have heard a lot about the difference between learning and acquisition, the whole Krashen set of hypotheses, not thesis, but hypotheses to say they are still to be proved, and most of them have been proved wrong. What we talk about now is about instructed second language acquisition. We consider that both acquiring and learning, both things, are needed in order to develop a new language. So you've done your guess or you've written your beliefs. Let me tell you about how we learn. And I'm going to take one perspective. I mean, when we get students, even if they are 2 or 3 years of age, we get people who already have significant experiences, right? And who can learn in different ways. To Vygotsky, learning is a prerequisite to development. So first you have to learn the language in order to be able to develop communicative competence. And when I say learn, that means appropriate something new. How do we do it? Well, if we go by what we've been discussing, the first one is self-resource. We all have memories. We all have background knowledge, personal experiences, beliefs that we bring to learning, right? And we can learn from those. We see something new and say, hey, I don't know that, but how do I connect it with? And that is how we make hypotheses and start connecting. Of course, because we're in formal education, another way of learning, another way in which students learn, is through what we call scaffolding, which is what we teachers do. And scaffolding happens at 2 levels. At the level of our planning, when we plan a lesson, we plan how to scaffold students' learning. And also at the contingent level, when we are teaching, we make decisions all the time. And those decisions need to be oriented not towards what we have in our lesson plan, but to how students respond to what we have in our lesson plan. So scaffolding actually means transferring control of the language over to students. That means they need to be actively engaged. They need to be doing things with the language and not just listening to us regurgitate language that we already know. But we know, and I think Emily made a great point there, that students love to learn from one another, right? And I think that is when we do this kind of collaborative learning, or when you have to do reciprocal teaching because your classmates don't know something, but you do, so you explain it to them. These two forms of cooperation, collaborative learning and reciprocal teaching, help the students learn more, sometimes even more than what they get through scaffolding. And who can deny the existence of technology aid learning in our day and age, particularly the impact of AI, right? Which all the hoopla, I still believe it's the same thing that happened to us when we started using recordings instead of just the teacher's voice, when we started using video and then computers in English language teaching. I've been in this profession for 43 years. This is my 43rd year as a language teacher. I've seen it all. I've seen all sorts of resources. I am the product of the audiolingual approach. Repeat after me, repeat after me. Yeah, I learned English like that. But then I started teaching with the audiovisual approach where you had to have flashcards, 7 flashcards for each new word, and you did drill after drill after drill. I was trained in that, and when I started teaching, it was the beginning of the communicative approach, PPP. So I've been through everything. I am a silent way practitioner. I was trained by Gateno's wife. I've done Suggestopedia, TPR, of course. So everything that has worked has been because teachers were able to apply the right thing to the student's learning need. And they have fostered not just one kind of learning. We learn by covering a unit in the book. No, we give space to learners to learn in these ways. And if we talk about current research on second language learning, second language acquisition theory, what we know is the language acquisition, and I'm going to refer to 2 authors who wrote a wonderful little book called Second Language Acquisition Goes to the Classroom, right? They are Henshaw and Hawkins, teachers of Spanish, not English, right? They have this wonderful definition of acquisition. It's the mostly implicit. Notice that it's mostly implicit, not exclusively implicit process of building a linguistic system. It's not learning a language, it's building a linguistic system. How do we do that? By connecting form and meaning from input that we receive. They say that on page 3 at the beginning of their first chapter, but later on, they give us this wonderful metaphor. Acquisition is what happens to you while you are busy understanding messages. Again, you see the simplicity, deceptively simple definition of acquisition shows how important it is to combine what we know with what we are learning, and more importantly, how meaning is fundamental. And if we look at the language acquisition comes from applied linguistics research. If we look at communication from linguistics research, and we say we teach a communicative approach, the first thing we need to do is to understand that communication is not just speaking. Van Patten in 2017 defines it as the expression interpretation, and negotiation of meaning. So there are three dimensions: expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning with a purpose within a given context. So it has to be purposeful interpretation, purposeful expression or negotiation of meaning in a given context. Again, we need to be able to read the content. And one thing that I would like to emphasize for those of you who are teaching in public education is that students, as Guy Cook says, are not learning the English they want or the English they need. They are learning English for tomorrow. In general, the argument for including English in the curriculum is so that when you finish high school, or when you go into the workforce, or when you go to university, or when you travel, but that is so far away in the future that students cannot make sense of this. So, what would be truly communicative or communication oriented teaching for children, teenagers, and adults who are in formal education? Well, they are students. They are not tourists, they are not celebrities, they are not customers. Yeah, the occasional role play may be fun, but basing a course on, oh, this you will need when it's too much of a leap for students to be able to engage with what we are doing. Now, if we ignore the context, we are not damaging them, we're not doing any harm to them, but we cannot say that we are engaging them in communication, which is what they want. Remember, they want to communicate in order to be motivated to continue learning. When we ignore the context and we create these very artificial situations that are meaningless to our students, what we are doing is language practice, which is a part of learning, but it shouldn't be the center of learning. So, what do students want to communicate about? Basically, the purpose of communication, as Henshaw and Hawkins say, is to learn about each other and the world around us. So, use the students' experiences, backgrounds as the starting point. Now, you may be thinking, oh, this is so beautiful. Yeah, he's so right. What wonderful ideas. But how do I do it? Well, before that, before we go into the actual nitty-gritty practical side of things, we need to summarize everything we have said in, in the form of some principles for teaching. And what I'm going to invite you to do is, again, for a second, think, what should one of those principles be? Right? Just what should one of those principles be? Short principles. If you want to share them in the chat, you are more than welcome to doing it. Otherwise, you can wait, and as we discuss each of these in turn, you can say, well, I got that one, or I didn't know about that one. Okay? If you want to write them in the chat. Clear objectives, creating context for learning. Wow, collaboration, constructive guidelines, inclusivity, personalization. Oh, yeah, all those things we need to take into consideration, as Emily demonstrated. Planning, yes, planning. I don't know what the situation is in your country, but in many places in Uruguay, teachers say, oh, I did planning when I was doing teacher training. Now that I'm a teacher, I don't need to plan. I have the book or I have the materials and I just cover the materials. Now, let me give you, according to what we have discussed, some principles for teaching. First one, the learners need to know what we are teaching them, but they also need to know why we are teaching them that and what for. And we're going to see how we do that. Secondly, learners need to consciously know what they already know before they learn something new. Third, The English language learning classroom, it's a place where students may feel threatened. There's a new language, these are new sounds, new letters, new ways of organizing discourse, new meanings, new culture. So there are too many uncertainties. We need to give them some certainty so that they feel safe to engage in communication. One way for doing that is by establishing routines that help learners feel secure, right? And give them more than security. They allow them to somehow control their learning. Now, this is not just wishful thinking, it's possible. Learners need to be actively engaged in the language and with the language. And you may say, yeah, but how do we motivate them? Well, the way we described motivation before, together with some of the strategies I'm going to show you in a minute, may contribute to that. But remember, we cannot motivate students. We cannot create motivation. What we can create are conditions, those necessary conditions, which help students motivate themselves. So take off the guilt of, oh, my students were not motivated today because my icebreaker was not useful. No. Think of how can I provide this certainty that the students need? How do I activate the background knowledge? How do I explain to them what to do, what we are doing, and why, and what for? For all these things to happen, meaning is, of course, paramount. Even at the time of working, when we are teaching the simple present, when we are using the timeline, even at that stage, everything should revolve around meaning, not just form. So, can you now tell me in the chat which of these principles look new to you? I'm going to go back to the slide with the principles so that you can read them. But I would really be interested, because of the widespread nature of our group today, what principles look new to you? You can write them in the chat. Number 2, number 3, none of them, of course. 2, 3, 2, 3, none of them, none. 2 and 3, well, interesting. 2 and 3 seem to be winning. 1 as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. What I wanted to prove is many of you said none of them. And do you know why? Because this is just good teaching. There's nothing new here. There's nothing that we haven't heard about, read, maybe 1 or 2 things you haven't been aware of. But I'm sure if you deep down think about your class situation, you are somehow trying to implement this principle in your teaching, even if you couldn't just put it into words, right? So these things are the common sense of language teaching. They have been with us for a long time. The only thing that I did is to put them together in a bundle that will allow us to translate these things into practical classroom activities, right? Which is what we're going to do now, right? Let's start with helping students make sense of what we do. The pictures that I'm going to be sharing with you are the work of my students, right? Students at the undergraduate level. I call this framework, if you wish, the 6 E's framework, right? The 5 E's, sorry, 5 E's framework. I'm going to add the sixth in at the end. But I would like to invite you to think on the chat what the E's stand for. I put a little bit of a little icon next to the E so that you can make an informed guess. What do you think the first E is about? Exploration. I love it. The first person who wrote it, right? Exploration. That was Duncan. Thank you, Duncan. Exploration. In every lesson that we teach, we need to engage students in exploring what they already know, but also in exploring what we are going to be teaching them. And here is what we have been doing with my students. First of all, they teach in public schools and in private schools and in language institutes. And one thing that happens is students tend to be late or arrive late from break, or if they come down from gym class. So my students, the first thing they do is put a do now activity, right, that they create connected to the topic. That has a dual purpose, right? The first thing is to review something that they have already done. Another reason for doing a do now activity is as students come into the classroom, they settle down and they focus on this is English, not math, science, or economics or whatever. And thirdly, we help them start activating their background knowledge. So the opening sequence of our lessons are like this. The teacher creates a do now activity, and then she explains or he explains. I always use she, not to discriminate guys, but because the great majority of language teachers in my country are ladies. So I respect gender balance in that sense. What the teacher does then is to tell the students, okay, you've done this activity, let's correct it. Like, why do you think we did this activity? So it's not like today we're going to learn. No, why do you think we did this activity? What can this help you prepare for? And then she says, okay, in today's class, what we're going to do, and they put up the agenda, right? The agenda that for many people is, oh, this is such a waste of time. This is, if you're teaching adults, oh, this is so childish. My students won't like it. Now, remember what we said about routines and certainty, the need to inform students what we're teaching them, why, and what for. The agenda creates like a plan that tells students here we are going to be doing some work today. So we need to cover all these things, right? First, we're going to revise vocabulary, then we're going to analyze a graph, read about social media apps, and then the teacher says, those are the learning outcomes. What are you now able to do from the agenda? Can you, and the students may say, well, I can say a few words about social media, right? And then the teacher asks, okay, everybody, just think, how good you might be in this part of the lesson, in the revision? Excellent, okay, or no good? Just show me with your hands, right? This is the self-assessment. And it may sound trite and not really useful, but the truth is that once you begin to make students aware of what they already know and you follow this up with goal setting. So tell me, for example, how many words do you think you can recall from what we have been working with? Or how many facts? Or what would you like to be able to do at the end of the lesson? This goal setting is what starts spurring motivation. All these things may be done in the case of monolingual classes, sorry, and particularly beginners. This may be done in the student's mother tongue, right? Or if you have a multilingual class, you may consider, now that we have ChatGPT, which translates fairly accurately, put in the agenda in the different languages that your students have, and explain the agenda to them. Now, notice that although this is teacher-led, it's not teacher-centered, because at each of these stages, the students are doing something, right? The students have done a do now activity, and they are telling you what they think this is done for. You show them the agenda, right? And immediately you engage them in thinking what they already can do about this. So this is the first E, exploration. Then the second E has this icon. Can you tell me in the chat what you think this E stands for? Hooking. Okay, it's an E. It has to start with a yes. Engage. Very good. Engagement, engaging, engaging. As you can see, the second component of the framework is intended to help learners engage. So again, we are building safety, we are building background knowledge, we're building expectations, we're giving them some security with the agenda. What do we do now? Well, we go directly into activating background knowledge through a myriad different possibilities. When you receive your handout, you will see for each of these E's, the 6 E's are, and these bullet points are there as well. But I have included a short list of activities that my students have applied in their classes that have been extremely effective. So the background knowledge about what? About the topic, first of all, right? The lexis associated with the topic, but also consider whether students know how to do what we ask them to do. This is facilitated engagement, and it's a follow-up, for example, to the do now activity. You give them a task, organize these words into categories, and give each category a name. But when you present those tasks, you ask the students after you have checked your instructions, have you ever done a task like this? Have we done a task like this in class? Yes or no? If they say yes, when? Remember, just try and think. When you did that task the last time, were you successful or not? Don't tell me. Just think. And then if you were successful, what did you do? If you were not successful, why? And this takes a minute, folks. Then you tell the students, would anybody like to share? Sometimes at the beginning of the course, until they get used to this, they don't want to share, right? So have a few examples of your own, right? Well, the first time I did this classifying task, what I found difficult was coming up with the category names for each of the columns. Putting the vocabulary was easy, but then creating, and the way I did it is I just went online, put these words, and tried to find a category. So you are not just teaching the students, you are giving them supports, scaffolds. You are promoting learning so that they can move on to through the zone of proximal development. The next T. What do you think it's about? Envision, encourage, experience, explore. It's actually, I call this moment encountering. And here is helping them see what is new. We may use any resource available. Here you have the board, and I don't know if you can read it if you're on a cell phone, but this is future will won't, future predictions, a very classic grammar explanation. But then there is this use of the rods, of questionnaire rods, to create a linguistic situation and to get students talking. So basically, here is when they meet the new inputs. And the first thing they need to do is to become aware, right? Now, one thing I forgot to say is that these are not sequential steps. It's not that first you do this, then you do that, then you do this. You gauge the learner's needs and you move along those needs. Awareness raising is because they need to see what is new. They meet the new input, but if they don't see what is new, they cannot start processing the meaning form connection they won't understand. So you check understanding and you can articulate the new inputs. When I say articulate the new input, it may be through discovery, through direct explanation, classical grammar explanation, through engaging the students in an activity, in a task that requires they use that language, and then um, having them observe a model of that task. This nowadays can be beautifully done with artificial intelligence, even as an audio piece, right? The same task you give students, you give to the artificial intelligence and say, create a dialogue or develop this task as if you were a student at A1 level, and it does it. This is perhaps the least favorite thing of our students when we go into grammar. They go, oh, God, grammar, right? So you want to teach with oomph, oomph, with strength. Well, you can't teach grammar with oomph if you follow my advice, but a different kind of oomph. This oomph. What students want to know is when to use certain kind of language. So the first thing you're going to focus on is on the use. Or the first thing that we focus on with my students is on the use. We look at the functions, we look at in which social situations we use that language. Then we explore the meaning. And for the meaning, we use typical examples taken from the input. We do comprehension checks. And then one of the reasons why most of our students don't speak is because we don't do enough pronunciation practice. So before we look at the form, we want to give them pronunciation activities that allow them to say what they now understand, right? It's making the form meaning connection. And the last thing, and you will notice that it will be the students telling you how to say it, is the form. So our classes are not will or won't. Our classes start with talking about the future, making predictions, and when the teacher gives at the beginning of the lesson the learning outcomes, you ask, how do you make predictions in Spanish? Do you know how to make predictions in English, etc.? So encountering is not enough. What else do we need? What do you think this E is about?
Gabrielle, just
Yes?
to warn you, we've got about 2 minutes and then we need to go to
Yeah.
questions. So if you
Yes,
can just
sure,
wrap me
sure.
up.
This is
Thank you.
experimenting. And you know the saying, practice makes perfect, they say. Well, to me, no. Practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Only perfect practice makes perfect permanent. And the way we do practice in our language lessons is by following the student's needs. We start with activities that require imitation, then substitution, then reconstruction, then manipulation. And one key element is that of personalization, when students can take the new language and use it to talk about themselves or the choice of topic they have. And last, communication. So experiencing, manipulating the language, following this principled approach is important. The last one is extending the input, not just leaving it in class. There, that means communicating, making sure that students try to bridge one of these gaps, opinion gap, information gap, or reasoning gap. At this stage, I would favor tasks more than exercises because exercises were part of the previous one. And one thing that works a lot for us are reconstruction tasks, like Dictocom, where they listen to speakers doing something and then they try to reconstruct it. The last but not the least is this extending. And I go back to the agenda towards the end of the class. The second task for communication is followed by a self-assessment. Remember what we said at the beginning of the lesson. What are you able to do now? Then asking a peer, do you think your peer can do that? How are you going to use this in the future? And that is goal setting again and forward planning. And we use the agenda to check, right? For example, which word that we revised means X? How many points were there in the graph? What was the graph about? What have you learned? Tell me something new you've learned about social media from reading. As you can see, you guys, I was trying to get you here, and I don't think we have a long time for this. But if you think about, yes, number one is okay. Number two, no. Students will create new language by showing that they can understand it. Forcing to speak students to speak early in the process does not slow down acquisition. Teaching grammar rules explicitly if students need it does not slow down. Correcting errors explicitly does not slow down the process if students request it. Acquisition helps build a linguistic system. This is what communication is about. Second language acquisition is not the same as first language acquisition because we have another background knowledge. And form meaning connections are fundamental to building the linguistic system. And I would like to finish by quoting Paulo Freire, right? Because if we bring it back to the world of education, what we have been discussing is ways of sharing information with students. And Paulo said, in reality, all information holds the possibility of expanding into education. Only if the information is critically received by the informed and not simply swallowed by him or her. So, my friends, I'm going to thank you for listening, and let's open the floor to questions. This is my bibliography. You will have it in your handout as well.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. That was so interesting, and I could tell people were really, really fascinated. So many good questions, and we can see that you're a wealth of knowledge and experience about how people learn and so many topics. Unfortunately, we've got very little time. Let's see if we can do a couple of questions. So if we're thinking about centering the learner, right? Hafsa has a good question, which is about the pressure of the curriculum. And they say, what about the curriculum that has to be implemented or covered in one session? If we follow only students' needs, then we won't cover the curriculum.
I remember when I was actually in the classroom, the first thing I did on the first day of class was to show the curriculum to the students and engage them from that day in two things: self-assessment and also choosing topics that they would like to do, things from the curriculum, and saying which of the parts of the curriculum they would like to spend more time in. And I would tell them, we have to cover everything, but there are things that you are more interested in, or you need more in order to be able to use the language. And we started like that. Unfortunately, a lot depends on the institution you work for or the powers that be, how much flexibility they allow you to have in your curriculum implementation, right?
Really.
But that could
Thank
be a good
you.
way of starting
That's
off.
that's a really good tip. Yeah. There's also a question on feedback from
Yeah.
Victor. What types of feedback do you think are most effective in supporting student learning?
I'm very partial to that question because I have my own way of giving feedback. Now, the first thing is feedback has to be ongoing and systematic. And we have to remember that providing feedback does not lead to uptake. That is to say, to the students actually using the feedback to improve the learning. Looking for ways of giving optimal feedback, I developed a little model framework that I call Show That You Care when you give feedback. And CARE stands for CARE. C is clarify. Not every student will need this feedback all the time, right? But when you have students who really struggle with learning, sit with them and clarify how did you do this? Why did you make that decision? Ask questions about things that you don't have control of and you don't know. Then a very important thing is, okay, now I'm going to tell you everything you did correctly. That
Mhm.
is the A in care, appreciate. Why? Because we seldom do that. And students work from a deficit perspective on themselves. So what we everything here that you did correctly. And now let's look at what you didn't do that well. That is reflect and engage the student in telling you where they made a mistake, right? And then don't be overambitious. Finish the feedback session with the empowering, that's the E in care, where you just give one or two tips on what to improve and you engage the learner in telling you when they are going to make that improvement, right?
I love that even your feedback is learner-centered. It
Absolutely.
comes from them. Okay, unfortunately, we are actually over time. Thank you so much. You're
Thank you
back
for
on
the
the
invitation.
25th of February, right? On Facebook.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm
Looking
sure a lot
forward
of
to
people
that.
will have questions there for you and want to hear more from you. So thank you so much. Thank you to Wayam on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks to Melissa, who's moderating. And we'll be starting again for our last session, our panel discussion on differentiation in 15 minutes. So
If you
thanks, everybody. Thank you,
just to
Gabriel.
say so that it stays in the recording, my email.
Yeah, it'll be in the handout as well. Or
Good.
if you're in Zoom, all of the links are coming to you. And if you're on Facebook or YouTube, then we'll share all the important information there too. So yeah, don't panic if
Thank
you
you,
miss
everybody,
anything.
for
Thanks,
staying. Bye
everybody. All
bye.
right, bye bye.